Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Draining the Swamp, What Does It Mean for Education Funding? We appreciate everyone joining us today. Before we start the program, I'm just going to review a few quick housekeeping items. We have a lot of information about the federal education budget and ESSA to cover today, but we're going to leave some time at the end of the presentation for questions. Again, there's a lot of information that we're going to go over, so as questions come up for you, go ahead and send them to me, and I'll put them in the queue to be answered at the end of the presentation. To send a question, simply click on the Questions tab on your control panel, type your question into the top box, and then click on the Send button. And I'll get it, and like I said, we'll put it into the queue to be answered at the end. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use that same question feature to get my attention, and I'll do my best to resolve the problem for you. The number one question that we usually get is, are we going to provide a copy of the PowerPoint slides and a recording? And the answer to that is yes. So keep an eye on your inbox for a link to those materials tomorrow. We'll also be posting them on the Agile website, which is agile-ed.com. Now let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Doug Mesecar. Doug has a diverse background, having held senior operational and policy roles at leading education companies, the U.S. Department of Education, and in Congress. Doug is currently Vice President of Strategic Partnerships for IO Education. In this role, Doug develops and supports national and multi-organizational relationships to enable the company's mission to improve educational outcomes through the effective use of data solutions and professional development. He also frequently writes on education technology and policy for the Lexington Institute, in addition to mentoring edtech startups through GSV Labs. At the U.S. Department of Education, Doug held a number of senior roles, including Deputy Chief of Staff of the Department, Assistant Deputy Secretary for the Office of Innovation and Improvement, and Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development. During his time on Capitol Hill, Doug was a professional staff member for the Education and Workforce Committee in the House of Representatives. Doug attended Hope College and the University of Denver, where he completed graduate work in education and earned his teaching license. He went on to teach 5th grade in the Jefferson County School System in Colorado, and he currently lives near Washington, D.C. with his wife, children, and dogs. We're really excited to have Doug with us again today and for him to share all of the valuable information that he has gathered on what the heck is going on in Washington and what the heck is going on with funding for education. So I'm going to go ahead and hand the program over to him now.
Wonderful. Thank you. And good afternoon, good morning, good day, I guess, to cover all. It's great to be back and look forward to covering a great deal of information and data and a little bit of speculation around the federal education budget, and in particular, and in honor of a familiar phrase that our new president likes to use, really going to focus on this drain the swamp mentality and approach that the current administration is taking toward a number of things, not least of which is the federal budget, and there are some real implications for education. So wanted to put a frame in here, and I'm not suggesting you hashtag anything that I mentioned today. I just saw this graphic and thought it was appropriate. It's a little dark and gloomy, and I think some may view what's going on with the education budget these days in that lens. I also thought we could sort of talk with an analogy around alligators and mosquitoes, which you tend to find in swamps, and some are quite dangerous and big threats, and others are more just annoyances. And I'll try to identify what I believe to be some of the big threats and some of the minor changes, annoying changes. So with that in mind, let's dive in. And the first place to start is really fiscal year 17. We are under a continuing resolution, which is, fancy government speak for we've continued the funding from the prior year, from FY16, at the same levels and for the same programs. So that continuing resolution is set to run out at the end of this month, April 28th. And there are a lot of things going on with the resolution of the funding for fiscal year 17. There are big picture items like border wall funding and more defense spending and then obviously for us, very specific implications around education. And first and foremost, if you're tracking the federal budget and the continuing resolution in FY17, there was an article yesterday where the White House is sending signals that they're going to push for some significant changes in funding for this fiscal year. And now remember, the federal fiscal year runs to September 30th. So we are in fiscal year 17, and there's not that many months left. So this push by the Trump administration to weigh in on the continuing resolution and the current budget is somewhat unusual, but then again, I think we're in a somewhat unusual time. So a lot of the bigger picture items is where I see most of the action happening, and if there isn't agreement, we certainly could face a government shutdown. That is a possibility, particularly if the current administration, the new administration, pushes for some of its priorities in a continuing resolution. Now, historically, the normal way of handling continuing resolutions is to effectively let it ride, maybe add some funding, and potentially tweak some items that need tweaking, and then live to fight another day. And in this case, that would be FY18. So we'll talk about FY18 in a second. I think one of the important points in the current discussion is that Trump the Trump administration, sort of below the radar, proposed $3 billion in education cuts for this year. So this would be $3 billion that would come out of fiscal year 17. They proposed a 50% reduction in Title II, zeroing out striving readers, the physical education program, a counseling program, other programs as well, along with a pretty significant cut to Pell Grants to get to that $3 billion cut. Now, it's unlikely that any of these cuts will happen. They were proposed pretty late in the process, and it's unlikely to see those large cuts happen over the next 4 or 5 months. But they're telling in that they're certainly sending a signal for FY18, and a lot of these reductions or cuts directly relate to what the president has proposed in FY18, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. So it's something to keep an eye on, particularly if we get into a where is funding going to come from for the border wall, for example, or if there is an increase in defense spending. You'll see that in FY18 budget, there is definitely we're going to increase defense spending and we're going to cut elsewhere to pay for that. So looking at FY17 over and putting it in the context of the last couple of years, so in 2015 for the U.S. Department of Ed, $67 billion were appropriated. Last year, a little above $68 billion, and if we carry that 2016 number through to this year, that would be $68 billion again. Now, the $3 billion would come off this number if it were to be cut from this, so FY17 could potentially be 65. Again, I don't believe that's very likely, but that's where the funding level is at, and this is for all Department of Ed programs, just to give you sort of a sense of where the funding is at over the last couple of years. So thinking about FY17, and not just in terms of the funding levels, but what about ESSA, and how does this impact not only just the implementation, but various programs under ESSA? So again, these are FY16 numbers carried forward into FY17, so we're not seeing any additional dollars for Title I, IDEA, other programs. But if you recall, there is the major new block grant, Title IV, which consolidates a lot of other smaller single-issue type programs. Now, the funding for Title IV, when you look at the appropriations process, was all over the map. ESSA suggested an authorization level of $1.6 billion. The House put in more than that. The Senate put in less. The outgoing Obama administration proposed $1 billion. And the issue we have here is that Title IV goes out by formula. And at the lower funding levels, it really doesn't net very many dollars for districts. $300 million spread across all of the districts in the country doesn't go very far. So there's been talk of converting Title IV into a competitive grant program whereby states would get their allocations and then run competition to dole out the dollars. Now, that would have the benefit of concentrating dollars in districts, but it would also have the consequence of creating winners and losers. This is something to keep an eye on, particularly doesn't seem to be a priority for the Trump administration. Whether Congress decides to go forward under this scenario, I think is still to be determined, but it is a topic of conversation. And there's another implication. I don't know that enough folks are talking about this, but ESSA made a pretty significant change around the equitable participation of private schools, which, as you know, they are entitled to get services, not direct funding, but services, and there's complicated ways in federal law in which those amounts of funding that support those services are determined. And so the key change here, and this affects Title I in a pretty significant way, is when you look at the reservation of dollars that would support services for private schools, that used to be calculated at the district level after you've taken out reservations for parental engagement and other set-asides. Now, when you look at, okay, so we've got to serve private schools, so what percentage of our poverty calculation comes from students attending private schools, and that creates your sort of allocation for your equitable services or equitable participation. So now you have to calculate that at the top level. So a district gets its Title I dollars, and you have to calculate how much service a private school or the private schools would receive before you take out any other reservation. So the net of that somewhat complicated, wonky explanation is that districts will be having to devote more service provision to private schools that may be in their districts. And so that means that there's going to be more service provided. Obviously, that means more funding associated to provide those services. And so that's going to alter some set-asides as well as some dollars that are flowing to these services, whether they're provided by the district itself or contracted out to third-party providers, which is allowed. So that's something to keep an eye on. Lastly, ESSA made some changes around school improvement grants. So if you recall, there was a separate school improvement grant program that was separately appropriated and authorized. Well, that's going away. Under ESSA, it's a 7% set-aside in Title I to support school improvement activities. There's a key here in that the no hold harmless applies to that in the first year of implementation. So that means that districts are going to see a pretty serious shift in dollars. Now, that may be offset because of the way ESSA is looking at how do you identify schools, which gets into the rather messy and complicated transition policies between the old law and the waivers under the old law, and then moving to ESSA. So another area to keep an eye on when we look at FY17 is, does Congress address this issue around school improvement grants, and the set-aside would actually also create fewer dollars available for the general provision of services in Title I because more dollars have to go towards school improvement because of the increased set-aside. If you recall, in federal law under NCLD, that set-aside was much lower. Okay. One last point to make, with all of the talk of choice, is there any choice being contemplated, any sort of programs or other support for private school choice, for vouchers, et cetera? Well, the answer is, in terms of FY17 funding and appropriations, no. There doesn't appear to be any movement toward adding new dollars or reallocating existing dollars toward a choice program. Now, and I'll talk about this later, there may be some movement around choice if a tax cut or tax reform moves in the form of some sort of, tax incentivized school choice programs. But as of right now, it doesn't look like there will be any new or additional programs that support private school choice in the FY17 appropriations. Okay, so I think we've covered FY17 as much as we can. There will be much more to come over the next couple of weeks, so I would watch your news outlets closely to see what the developments are, particularly around government shutdown, around the Trump administration priorities, and then obviously with the trade press for education, how some of this may play out across some of these major policy areas. So if we look forward now to FY18, which again, that's not that far away, Trump released in March a so-called skinny budget, and I put a link to it here in the slide. There's not a lot of detail. So not only is it a skinny budget in the sense that it's cutting a lot, it's also skinny in just sort of factual information. What they are proposing for education is a $9 billion cut, which is a 13% reduction. That's one of the largest reductions in the budget, but not the largest. The EPA has the distinction of receiving the largest proposed reduction in funding. But a 13% reduction is significant. We'll break down what that reduction means in a minute, but I wanted to talk just a little bit about, because this is important not only for FY18 but for future years. So there's a lot of discussion about, well, how did this budget get built? And most point to the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank here in Washington, D.C. They put out a budget blueprint earlier this year, and it seems as though the Trump administration's FY18 budget borrows a lot from the Heritage Foundation. So in terms of looking to the future, I would watch closely what the Heritage Foundation is putting out regarding the budget, because it appears to have a pretty significant influence on the administration's thinking. But let's dig into that a little bit more. So what is driving this focus? Well, one is the small government, private sector philosophy, meaning that the current administration and the majorities in Congress were elected around the rallying cry for their voters of the government's too large, that we have to downsize government and transfer, responsibility for many things to the private sector, or just stop it completely. So that is a very significant and strong influence on budgeting moving forward. You also heard, or you may have seen, that the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget Director, Mick Mulvaney, who is a very conservative former member of Congress, he talked a lot about a perceived lack of evidence of success for programs in education. So he talked about, there's not a lot of evidence of success for Title II, for 21st century community learning centers, but that is a common refrain. And I think it's a significant development that they're starting to make arguments, whether you agree with them or they're supported by facts or not, but they're trying to make the argument around what's the evidence of success. And I think that's a trend that we'll see crop up more and more as we look to not only federal budgeting, but state and local budgeting as well. And then the other big motivating factor here is the plus-up, the increase in spending for defense. So you have defense discretionary spending of, which is the largest discretionary spending category in the federal budget outside of non-discretionary spending like Social Security and those types of programs, entitlement type programs. So they're looking to add $54 billion to defense, which actually in the scheme of things is not a huge increase, although it's a lot of money. A famous senator in Washington, Rayburn, who one of the Senate office buildings is named after, once said, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. Well, that's kind of true here as well. So to pay for the defense plus-up, they're looking to cut $54 billion out of non-defense discretionary spending. So these are education programs, EPA programs, NASA, other types of programs, NIH. the CPB, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So they're looking at ways to offset that spending increase. So when we dive into the U.S. Department of Ed budget, again, we're looking at, actual numbers, and of course 2017 isn't quite actual yet, but I think it will be coming in at that number. So the president's, quote, skinny budget for the U.S. Department of Education is coming in, pretty significantly lower. So a $9 billion cut, a 13% decrease is a $59 billion budget. So a pretty significant shift there. And then when you look at non-Pell, so if we take out Pell Grants and look at largely K-12 programs, we have, a decrease here where it's going from 45 to 46 to 46 in 2017. Again, that's projected, and then 2018 proposed. So how does that translate then into specific programs? So the skinny budget is pretty skinny on facts, but there are some real signs and indicators of where the administration wants to go. With Title I, they propose a $1 billion increase, which on its face sounds like a pretty positive development, but they're proposing that the increase go to a portability experiment. If you may recall in ESSA, there was a lot of talk around making Title I funds portable, meaning they would move with the student as the student changed schools, meaning public schools primarily, and if they had a voucher program, they would move with the student to a private school as well. So their $1 billion increase is tied to this notion of Title I portability. There's also this idea in ESSA of weighted student funding, where you combine federal, state, and local funds, and you're really weighting the funding. So each student would potentially get a different amount depending on characteristics, whether, for example, they're EL or they're special ed or they're low-income students, where they get a differential based on characteristics of students. And in ESSA, up to 50 districts could approach funding in this way, which is not quite portability, but it's a notion of altering the normal delivery that we've seen, for quite a while of Title I funds, the way they are driven by formula from federal to state to district and then allocated across the district around certain rules. So the weighted student funding is something to watch. There's been some experiments and ongoing experiments in districts across the country with this idea, and it really starts to shift the notion of how funds should be allocated and how providing the same amount for every student, regardless of their background or where they're going to school, is starting to change. So something to keep an eye on. So again, FY18, Trump's skinny budget, they're proposing to level fund IDEA. And then if you recall back to FY17, they're proposing a significant cut in Title II. Well, in FY18, they're proposing to zero it out. And the same for 21st Century Community Learning Centers. Now, they're also looking to increase or create, frankly, a new program around private school choice and vouchers. So they're proposing a $250 million program for vouchers. It's very unclear what that means. There aren't any details. They just put a number in there. So can't really determine how that might be run or how the dollars would be allocated, anything like that. On charters, so charters have seen a pretty significant increase, the charter school program, and in the Trump budget, they're going to get potentially a huge new increase of another $168 million, which would take that program to over $500 million annually, which is a huge increase. Not that long ago, it was only at $250 million, and not that long before that, it was really quite small. So that's a significant increase. But the interesting thing here is that a lot of the large charter operators, the nonprofit, CMOs, charter management organizations, have come out and signed an open letter saying if these other programs are going to be cut, and they're more broad than just education. Their letter involves health care and other proposed cuts in the federal budget. But essentially they're saying, we don't want this $168 million increase for the charter school program if it comes at the expense of other programs or these other cuts. So it's a pretty significant development where you see the charter schools starting to line up with more traditional public school approach toward the federal budget. So that's something to keep an eye on, and a development that's pretty interesting. There's cuts proposed to impact aid, which is definitely worth keeping an eye on, and then some pretty significant cuts in higher ed around Pell, TRIO, Gear Up. The big cuts, obviously, in Pell, because that's where a lot of the dollars are. Now, there's an old saying in D.C. that the president proposes and Congress disposes, said most frequently by Hal Rogers, who was the former Appropriations Committee chair. And there's another old saying in D.C. that, there's really three parties. There's Republicans, there's Democrats, and there's appropriators, because they're a pretty independent breed, and they don't always follow party lines when they're appropriating federal dollars. And really every member of Congress tends to say this because they're a separate branch of government, and that's their prerogative. So just to update that saying, the president proposes, education broadly, kind of put that in quotes, opposes, and the Congress disposes. I would say it's pretty fair to say that most of the sort of educational establishment is not in favor of what the president is proposing in his either FY17 or FY18 budget. So what I'm getting at here is the checks and balances inherent in our government, that congressional discussions around FY18 haven't even started. So there's a lot that could happen, but none of it has happened. And it's worth remembering, again, that FY17 does sort of indicate in some respects how FY18 is going to go. So some of the decisions made this year will have an impact on next year. And, there's a lot going on at the federal level. You've got repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act. You've got a lot of discussions around tax reform, a potential infrastructure bill, and then, of course, our old friend sequestration, which is, acts as a cap on spending. So when we think about all of these different broader topics that may play a role in FY18, it's just too soon to predict how any of this is going to play out yet. What I will say, though, is that, the House couldn't pass an Affordable Care Act replacement. They're going to try again, apparently, in the pretty near future. But just because Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the White House doesn't mean that they're all going to agree or able to get things done the way you might normally expect. And in particular in the Senate, the Republican majority in the Senate is very narrow. And if you watched the confirmation battle over Secretary DeVos, there are a few key senators who are definitely more moderate, who are unlikely to go along with some of these radical changes in the education budget that are being proposed. And that's true both for FY17 as well as for 18. If you recall, Senator Murkowski was an opponent of Secretary DeVos's over private school choice. And I've talked, with different folks on the Hill, and there's, definitely agreement that anything that has private school choice in it, whether it's a funding bill or an authorization bill, will be next to impossible to get through the Senate under the current situation. Now, that could change the next election cycle. We'll see if the Republicans grow their majority or not. But if they don't grow it by very much, or in fact, if the Democrats take over control, a lot of these proposals for private school choice and vouchers aren't going to go anywhere. And there's some that believe that they may not even be able to make it through the House, which has a much larger Republican majority. So these different high-level, huge topics that are listed here are going to take up a lot of oxygen and a lot of time and could affect the budget scenario in terms of deficits and how much revenue is coming in. And what that all plays out means that I think education will not be a top priority when it comes to funding, when it comes to decision making, which tends to leave it to a more status quo approach. If folks don't want to spend a lot of political energy fighting the battles over different education funding changes, then they kind of default to, well, we'll make some tweaks on the margins, but probably not significant changes. So something to keep in mind as we talk through some of the scenarios here. Okay, so let's transition now. So I've given you some overview of what's happening at the federal level, but let's talk for a minute about what kind of impacts might this have on district budgets and on purchasing. And my first point is a little bit of a non sequitur in the sense that it's all about data. And we'll get into this more in a couple of slides, but data is like water. It's everywhere and it's necessary to continue on the direction we're heading in. And what I mean by that is there is a lot of data being produced in districts today, both on achievement, on outcomes, on spending, and I think we're going to start to see a greater focus, back to my comment about the FY18 budget and the focus on, well, what evidence of success do we have? So I think, being able to show that this investment with the dollars that we received produced tangible results, whatever that may be, and it's not just test-based results, it's going to be critical. So data is like water, I think, is an important thing to keep in mind, and I know that districts are thinking that way, and vendors certainly should be as well. So the federal budget changes and the continuing resolution and the uncertainty, I think, will cause some delayed decision-making as districts kind of watch to figure out, well, am I going to continue to receive the funds that I've received at the same level? Is this program potentially going away? And I think it will also make them a bit more conservative. Now, national trends also show that while in some states spending on education is creeping up or increased quite a bit, there's still a number of states who haven't gotten back to even 2008 levels. So when you add a more conservative, limited funding environment on top of federal uncertainty with some of these dollars, it really, I think, is going to have some impact on districts where they receive a lot of federal dollars. The other sort of piece that comes into play here is how do these potential government shutdown, reduction in funding for various programs, how is that going to affect the U.S. Department of Education? It very well might. Their ability to be responsive, to get timely guidance out, to do monitoring, all of those types of activities that tend to help add a little bit of grease, if you will. They tend to reduce some of the friction in the system. That may not be there, and that could also slow down districts using federal dollars. But a counterpoint to that is the funding flexibility in ESSA. And before I leave this slide, though, I do think it's important to remember that, this graphic here of spending is from Ed Week from a couple of years ago. And it's pretty interesting how the dollars cluster around that $10,000 number. I know this has gone up a little bit over the last couple of years, and you've got the real outliers on the far right that spend an awful lot. But the majority of the spending is still state and local. The average federal contribution is between 8 and 12%, call it 10 on average. Some districts, obviously, it's much higher, and some districts much lower, depending on usually the amount and concentration of poverty. So this is important to keep in mind that there's still dollars in districts from state and local budgets, and that the federal dollars come into play and tend to, can play that tipping role where they may tip a purchase one way, or the federal dollars added in, if they can be added in, can create a significant, kind of bump around aggregating dollars. But, these numbers are worth keeping in mind, that it's not like we're falling off a cliff here at this point. It's just we've got some headwinds, I think, around budgeting and purchasing. So let's talk about funding flexibility because it's related to making existing dollars go further or be more flexible. So ESSA made some changes to supplement, not supplant, and you've probably heard about some of those, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time getting into the wonky details, but the supplement, not supplant changes, and there is no regulation, by the way, and likely won't be any additional regulation around this. So the statute is going to carry, and it's pretty flexible, and it allows districts more flexibility in how they count spending towards the supplement, not supplant requirement. And back to my earlier point about the U.S. Department of Education, their ability to interpret what the statute says, get guidance out there, as well as to monitor and potentially audit after the fact is going to be somewhat constrained. So I think the changes there tend to loosen the current constraints around Title I spending, not kind of floodgates by any stretch, but certainly I think the federal programs director, the Title I director inside districts is going to have a lot more friends because I think you can make case, particularly at the line item level, that a particular expenditure is no longer supplanting, but in fact is just supplemental, which is allowable. Now, also under ESSA, you may recall around school-wide that the poverty percentage to run a school-wide program, and again, a reminder there is where you can serve all students in a school with Title I or other federal dollars rather than targeting those services to just the low-income students at risk. And it also brings the benefit of it's easier to consolidate federal, state, and local dollars in a school-wide program. So it's a much more flexible approach to using federal dollars. States can now provide essentially blanket waivers to districts and therefore schools that if they want to go below that 40% threshold to use a school-wide program, they can do that. Now again, back to the U.S. Department of Education's role, how far below 40% can they go? It's unclear from federal law, but I think there will have to be some guidance. Is 30% the bottom that you could go to? Could you go to 25%? Because at some point, if you have no concentration of poverty calculation in how you're using Title I dollars, then it just becomes a general program that can serve everyone and loses its focus. So there's a balance here. But the school-wide program is an important one to keep an eye on, and how states are going to handle waivers, this ability to sort of provide blanket waivers to say you can go below 40% poverty threshold to use this school-wide authority. Now, transferability is not something that's typically used that frequently, but it is a really powerful tool to combine dollars. Now, federal law basically protects Title I, III, and V. But between Title II, Title IV, you can move dollars around and supplement those dollars, and they effectively take the characteristic of the program that you're transferring them into. So that's another authority that districts have, and as we see the dollars and budgets sort of leveling off, I think this transferability authority, the school-wide, the supplement, not supplant, will become more important. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about ed. So this slide, I tried to have a little fun, diminished head. And will there be a risk? And it's important to point out that, not that long ago, the administration put out through the OMB this directive essentially that says, we're going to reform the federal government and reduce the federal civilian workforce. And one of the directives in this memo that went to every agency was to determine whether the costs of continuing to operate an agency, a component, or a program are justified by the public benefits it provides. There are 3 other directives with the end goal of we want to reduce the size and the scope of the federal government, either the programs it administers or the workforce that it currently employs. It's unclear how this is going to play out because any significant changes would require legislation, but certainly the effort and the focus around reducing the government is an area where there is a bit of discretion. They did lift the hiring freeze, for example, but it was a fairly tentative lift in the sense that it's not like they said, okay, you can start hiring again. It's definitely viewed in the lens of we're only going to hire in the areas that we deem are important or necessary to the operation of the federal government. So, defense is probably going to be pretty high on the list of starting to hire again. I would say a lot of other agencies, not so much. And it's not just the civilian, employees in the sense of, the civil service. It's also the political appointees. There has been some movement at the U.S. Department of Education to bring on a few more staff, but it's still largely Secretary DeVos, a handful of trusted aides, and then the normal career civil servants at the U.S. Department of Education. So the number of political appointees who usually set policy and drive the agenda, there aren't that many of them. And so as you look at the budget numbers, as you look at what they're trying to do in cutting programs, I don't think we're going to see a very quick pace to fill political appointee positions that, for example, we still haven't heard of a deputy secretary nomination. There's no assistant secretary for elementary and secondary ed. There has been a general counsel nominated, but a lot of the senior positions aren't there, which makes it more difficult for the Department of Ed to really set policy. Career civil servants are there to really execute on the policies. They do a very good job, in my opinion, of carrying out the policy agenda of the administration that's currently, in power. And so asking them to do more than kind of keep the lights on is a difficult ask and not one that they're likely to embrace, which generally means that the Department of Ed, its role is going to be diminished, frankly. That doesn't mean, though, that it will affect the distribution of funds. I don't see any change in terms of how funds go out. Even if there's a shutdown, I don't think it'll last very long, and prior shutdowns have never really affected the distribution of federal dollars. Impact aid to a certain degree, but really it's not a huge impact there. It could impact ESSA implementation, particularly around peer review, around setting some of the policies that I've talked that are in ESSA, and then monitoring and enforcement. So the role of the Department of Ed going forward, particularly around funding and monitoring funding and decision making, I think is going to be a less active and a less clear role than it has had in the past. So something there pretty important to continue to keep an eye on. Okay, so I wanted to hit a few other topics here as we wind up this session, and I want to leave some time for questions, but there's a number of other influences affecting district budgets, spending decisions, the federal budget. The first is the Andrew ruling, which is the huge decision that was reached a couple of weeks ago where the Supreme Court effectively raised the bar, in my opinion, around what it means to provide services to special education students. Now, I am not a special education lawyer, and I can't really deconstruct this case for you, but there's plenty of good analysis out there. What I can tell you, though, is that I think every district is probably reviewing whether or not it can meet this new standard that the Supreme Court effectively put into place. And I think parents and their advocates are going to be looking very closely. And so I think it's going to result in additional services being provided to special education students, as well as potentially more litigation around this new standard, which will have an effect on budgets for sure. Just yesterday, another Supreme Court case with huge implications for education was verbal arguments were held, and it's a case out of Missouri and Trinity Lutheran Church versus Comer. And the issue at hand here is Establishment Clause and whether government programs that have a general benefit, in this case it was about that rubbery recycled tire surface and playgrounds, and whether or not a church school playground could receive funding. And the state said no, and they cited Establishment Clause, First Amendment, clause, Blaine Amendment type issues where it basically says no support can go to private religious institutions, whether it's school or otherwise. So that case was heard. And if the Supreme Court, by the way, now that it has Gorsuch in place, back to a sort of more conservative majority, if they overturn the Missouri decision and basically say that private schools, private institutions that have a religious character or are religious in nature can receive benefits from, public programs like the one in Missouri, even though it was around playgrounds, could really open up the legal landscape around private school choice programs. So that one is worth watching. Now, it's unclear which way the court will go, but that could have a huge impact, and of course, kind of dovetails in a really extraordinary way with some of the things that President Trump and DeVos have been talking about around private school choice. Now, infrastructure spending, I touched on this a bit before, but this is the idea that the Trump administration wants to put a bunch of money, including money for building and renovating schools, into place as kind of a lift to the economy. It's unclear what this may be, whether Republicans will support this spending, but there could be an injection of dollars around construction, renovation, potentially, infrastructure inside buildings, particularly around wiring and technology that could come into play over the course of the next year. The ACA, repeal and replace, depending on how that comes out, could affect district budgets in terms of how they're going to handle health care. So keep a close eye on that. Again, there could be a Republican bill being pushed as early as next week on this. And there's been a lot of conversation around changes to the healthcare market could have a negative impact on district budgets. There's also a lot of talk around changing the school lunch program, everything from throwing out Michelle Obama's changes to the school lunch program that were sort of widely publicized and in some cases criticized, as well as potentially tightening up eligibility and other changes that could restrict those dollars. So that's another trend to keep a close eye on. The prevalence of ed tech and personalized learning is also going to play in here as districts look to use technology to be more effective and efficient, not only in management of resources, but how they deliver instruction, how they monitor instruction. There's a lot there that we could spend another hour on, but I wanted to flag that. And sort of related to that, the new chairman, Ajit Pai of the FCC, is wanting to make lots of changes and reverse lots of decisions that the prior chairman had led under Obama, everything from changing E-rate potentially. He's already moved to change the Lifeline program that provides phones to low-income folks. So the FCC and how the E-rate may change and how those dollars may be used is going to be another trend and another pretty significant change if much is done there. So keep an eye on that. I think also all of these changes, data, there's a lot more focus on return on investment and performance-based funding. So if you recall, ESSA has reporting on expenditures. So what is the federal, state, and local personnel and non-personnel contribution to the per pupil? So that has to be publicized, and part of it's an equity argument around, are we spending equivalent amounts and where are the sources coming from on high income, middle income, low income schools? And, kind of net on this here is I think the role of a superintendent, I put, EDD, meaning I have a doctorate in education, versus the CEO. It's really probably both. It's not a versus, it should be an and. Superintendents have an increasingly difficult challenge of really being effective stewards of not just, the educational mission of a district, but also the spending and how the dollars are used. And this little graphic on the right, you don't spend too much time on it, but it's just the idea here that, as we look at managing districts, it's really involving not just the academic output, but program alignment, program efficiency. Are we, implementing with fidelity? Are we improving the program? Do we have expenditure visibility? So there's a lot of different aspects of the role that I think are changing, and that these trends and these budget pressures and just the focus on are we getting results is really changing the nature of district budgeting as well as superintendent and district leadership. Not least of which, not least of which is the evidence-based funding that is in ESSA, and it talks about evidence-based approach where you're really looking at how much evidence do we have to support a particular activity, program, or approach. And I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail. This will be in the slides that you can get later. But whether it's Title I, Title II, Title III, Title IV, the idea that we're using an evidence-based approach to what we're doing in districts and what we're spending dollars on, and what are the different tiers of evidence that you should be looking for, whether it's an existing program or a new program. And it's not the sort of gold standard, quote-unquote gold standard under NCLB of research where it's a randomized control trial. It's a more nuanced approach, but still heavily embedded in ESSA. There's a few more here. Certainly, the growth in choice, we've talked about that. Don't forget about the increasing job shortages for teachers. It may be that the amount of dollars allocated toward salaries and personnel, it may actually increase as they have to spend more to attract and retain staff, teachers, or it could go down in that they're looking to redirect some of those dollars because they have to. If they can't find teachers, those dollars may migrate to other spending priorities. We've talked about revenue shortfalls, and the last couple of thoughts here for you are around, the last 25 years we've seen a roughly 50% increase in K-12 federal, state, and local spending from about $300 billion to $600 billion annually. I don't think we're going to get to $1.2 trillion in another 25 years. Now, I could be wildly wrong. I just don't see the budgets and the dollars growing that significantly. So that creates, again, a lot of pressure on evidence of effectiveness, efficiency. And then, this last point is one that I think is a little bit more philosophical, but it does have a consequence with ESSA's focus on state and local control. It really puts an emphasis on state and local funding and might have the consequence of, well, if all the decisions are made at the state and local level, shouldn't the dollars be at the state and local level as well? And so I think that the federal budget, when you think about the state and local emphasis and decision-making in ESSA, I think that trickles through to federal education funding and could be a natural consequence of this approach to state and local control. We'll see, but it's something certainly to think about and chew on. So it probably feels a little bit like, the government, the funding is getting tossed out, being overthrown. But honestly, particularly for FY17, I think the dollars are still going to come out. I think that even in FY18, we're not going to see, a 13% cut. I could very well be wrong about that, but I just don't see the political will there to make that kind of cut that significant of a cut. But longer term, there are certainly some trends and some shifts in the way funding is looked at, the different pressures on funding, law changes at the Supreme Court level that certainly bear close watching and close attention. So with that, I went a little bit longer than planned, but certainly I think we have time for a few questions. So I'm going to pause here and see if we got any.
Yes, we definitely did, and I think it's totally fine. You went a little long because you had a lot of great information to share. And so just as a quick reminder to everybody, we will be sending out a copy of these slides and the recording. So in case you weren't able to jot down or remember everything that Doug showed here with all of these numbers and different programs, you will be able to access those later tomorrow. So let's get to our first question. So in this skinny budget, Title II is zeroed out. Do you have any sense of whether there is any hope for retaining some of that funding? Are there people actively in Congress who are advocating to keep it? Is it just Trump advocating to cut it, or do others want to cut it? Kind of give us a little more about Title II.
Sure. I'll try to do it real quick.
Okay.
So it's pretty much only Trump talking about zeroing out Title II. I haven't seen that suggested anywhere else. It's a pretty important source of professional development funding, and other support. Class size relief is often funded with Title II dollars. So again, back to my sort of broader comments, I don't see radical change around Title II. I don't even see a 50% reduction, but there's always a lot of criticism of what do we get for those dollars, and do we really see improvements in teacher practice because of Title II professional development? So I do think that there's going to be pressure on Title II, and I would expect that we'll see some potentially modest declines in Title II, but certainly not a zeroing out, and certainly not even a 50% reduction. I just don't see that that's going to happen, particularly if those dollars are being funneled into, for example, choice programs, because choice just doesn't have, I think, enough political support at this point, at least in the next year or so. So if you're going to cut Title II, where are the dollars going to go and for what purpose? And I just don't see a great alternative to it at this point. So I would say definitely watch it close, but I wouldn't expect that it's going to see, those kinds of radical changes.
Okay, great. Our next one is, do you think that the reduced funding or the push for reduced funding at the federal level is going to impact private foundation grant funding, either positively or negatively?
Oh, that's an intriguing question. I think that there's been quite a bit of change in foundation funding, and I do think that some foundations will try to make up shortfalls if they do wind up coming into play for some of these programs. But I don't know that I have a great answer to that question, because I think some of the changes in foundation funding have been sort of because they've wanted to change their approach, or they haven't necessarily, felt like they've gotten all the results they've wanted to. So that's one thing I didn't put on here, is I think some of the trends affecting district budgets are also affecting foundation giving, particularly around data and evidence of success, and being more efficient with those dollars. I think the days of kind of general dollars going for more general approaches are long gone, and I think it's very targeted, very specific funding, and with real clear evidence of success tied to it, or expected success. I think that's probably the bigger trend right now than any of these federal shifts in dollars.
Okay, that makes sense. And we'll go ahead and see if we can squeeze in at least one more question here. What is the future of the EDGAR regulations regarding funding and ESSA?
Wow, that's a detailed question. I love it. Wow. All right, we're going to end on a really wonky one. That's awesome. And actually, though, the answer is going to be, I think, pretty short. So I know that, career staff are working away, but, I don't know, frankly, how the political staff at the department are going to be able to review that and get it out in a timely fashion. That has to go through, the different layers at the department. So I'm sure the career staff have been working, are working, will continue to work, but, it's going to take some time to get through the approval process. So, and, if there's a potential government shutdown, or if there continues to be, sort of lack of staff at the department, I think it's going to take some time. And I think there's some really tricky questions, and this is why the political staff point really is important. So supplement, not supplant. I don't believe that the good career folks at the department are going to go out and try to interpret that all on their own. They really need the political staff to weigh in with how they think and how they want that to be interpreted, certainly within the constraints of the law, but it's a really wide open issue. So it's going to, particularly on some of the bigger issues, some of it doesn't change that much. Like the Title I funding formulas didn't really change a whole lot. But, the distribution and application of the hold harmless for school improvement grants, again, it's not simple stuff. And the lack of staff or even the sort of ability to add staff to address some of this, I think, is going to have an impact. So great question. I wish I had a more definitive answer, but I do think that the EDGAR regulations are going to be slower, and I don't think they're going to be quite as definitive as we might want them to be. And so that creates some uncertainty in the system as well. And the ability for the department to respond to questions if they put out some guidance or some regulations around this, I think is going to be slower as well. So I think there's going to be more uncertainty out there on the use of federal dollars under ESSA than there certainly has been under prior law.
Great. Well, I do wish that we had more time, but thank you very much for everything you covered and for answering all those questions. So everyone, thank you for joining us today. Just a quick little plug for our next webinar that is scheduled for May 18th. We're going to be joined by the former Executive Director of Educational Technology in the Klein Independent School District in Texas, Ann McMullen, and Tom Murray, who is the Director of Innovation for Future Ready Schools. And together, Ann and Tom are going to share how the EdTech community can help districts and schools have successful technology implementation, which is a win-win for vendors and educators. So keep an eye on your inbox and the Agile website for more information about that next webinar coming up in May and how to register. And again, keep an eye out tomorrow for a link to the recording and the slide of this fantastic webinar that Doug did for us. And it's just a heads up, Doug will be joining us again in June, so you'll get the opportunity to take advantage of more of his insight and expertise here in a couple months. So thanks, everyone, and have a great afternoon.